Well, I can get them tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm having cataract surgery. Can't do it tomorrow. I'm getting it tomorrow.
Mail version, it's hard to believe it.
But I'll get to it either tomorrow.
Hello.
Good morning.
Jay, have you started streaming? Fantastic. First of all, just wanted to welcome Kerri. I have to get closer to the mic. This is Kerri. All of you are in the first service. You heard her already. Second, I want to acknowledge the fact that there's a big piece of blue tape on the floor. So we're trying something of trying to improve the sound quality for YouTube. So thanks for everyone's patience as we test this out. So I'm going to pass this on to Kerri.
Good morning again. I have a whole bunch of information to drop in less than an hour. But I'm still hoping to make room for questions and dialogue. I'm going to do my absolute best. If we don't get to your question, I am going to leave my email at the end, and you are welcome to email me. Also, I will say it now. The website for the Wisconsin Council of Churches is really easy and intuitive. You ready? wichurches.org. If you can't track down my email address or remember my name, wichurches.org has response forms up the wazoo. And you can find one and say, I want to talk about land acknowledgments, I have questions. And whatever response form you put it into, it will end up getting to me. So, this workshop is about land acknowledgments done better, because there are too many land acknowledgments that are done in ways that are hurtful to our native kin, and perhaps, while done with the best intentions, could be done better. Hence, I already told you what the Wisconsin Council of Churches is, so I don't have to go there. Before we get to the what of a land acknowledgement, we start with the why, and that was the gospel lesson you heard in worship this morning. It's the act of repentance and repair. When you're offering your gift, remember, if your siblings got something against you, go and make it right. Nothing else is more important. This is the foundational scripture we use in all of the council's work on Indigenous justice. Right here. This is in the context of the Beatitudes, by the way. So if you remember the other things that happen in Matthew 5, there's a whole bunch of justice talk. This is a big public teaching. This is not Jesus just giving a little secret teaching to his disciples. This is big, public, important stuff he wants everybody to know. Hence, I always invite people to think about also what brings you here. Why are you here? Are you here because you're wrestling with a personal question, whether you want to work on a land acknowledgement for an organization you're a part of, whether you just have intellectual curiosity? What's your end goal with being part of an event like this? Because that affects how you listen. Reverend Stephanie Perdue, maybe some of you read her article, I know I shared it with Pastor Charlie, says that land acknowledgements in Christian communities aren't just political, but they're theological and they're liturgical. They're an act of remembering. They call the past into the present for the sake of the future. In other words, they do a lot of work. They're not just pro forma. I talked a lot about stories this morning, and I like using this quote from our former poet laureate. All the stories in the earth's mind are connected. So the story we tell about reparations, about repair, about what we're responsible for, are interwoven into that past, and in some ways start knitting things together. We need to remember that colonization and colonialism isn't just a history lesson. It's not just something that happened in the past, that it's an ongoing process that we participate in. So that's one fact that sometimes people struggle with. It's not just a thing that happened a long time ago. Okay, that's done and over with, and hey, good. Can we just move on now? We can't do anything about that. And then the other piece is one that I talked about in the sermon this morning, the land and the people being one. So everything we do that hurts the land, everything that we do that creates a distance between people and land is a trespass, right? So both of these are part of the whys. We're talking about something much broader. We're like, oh yeah, I acknowledge the land. You didn't just acknowledge the land. It's like, yes, this is the land of the so-and-so people. Oh, there's a whole lot more tangled up in that. It's a whole complex of concepts, siblings, cultures, families, traditions, futures, pasts. I don't know if any of you have seen this map before. This comes from wisconsinfirstnations.org. The brightly colored areas, the large areas, represent tribal lands about the year 1800. And the small, paler bordered areas and the dots represent the area occupied by present-day Native nations. What you notice? Shrunk. What else do we notice?
Unconnected.
Disconnected. What else do we notice? Anything else?
They're pushed to the far north part of the state.
Pushed to the far north, not necessarily desirable property. I mean, yeah, I know we all talk about up north and property being expensive and all, but not necessarily desirable, commercially valuable land, right? Are there things you wonder about this?
How those areas were selected.
How those areas were selected?
Why all the lakefront? Why all the lakefront? That's like Michigan, the white on the left, right, correct? What's the white band down the right?
Oh, that's just graphic design. Good question, though.
It seems like the dots border each of the areas.
Yeah, so the dots, I talked about the Ho-Chunk. They are really dispersed in lots of different communities, as opposed to having really a large piece of reservation land. Remember I talked about 10 million acres from the Mississippi to the Rock? That's a lot different. So keep this in mind. I talked about doctrine of discovery in the sermon. That was the foundation for all Indian law in the US. It's still cited as legal precedent, still used by courts to decide property rights cases brought by Native Americans against the US and against non-natives. Again, this is not ancient history. This is not past tense. If again, those foggy ideas in your head from your history class about westward expansion and manifest destiny and these things that we learned about in US history classes are all tangled up with those papal bulls. Because there is a divine right. There is a destiny. We have a right to this land, goes the mental construct. Fortified with divine love, writes the Pope, the right to lands, places, estates, camps, and any other possessions, mobile and immobile goods, found in all these places and held in whatever name, and the right to lead these non-Christian persons, which they're non-Christian, so they're not persons, lead their persons in perpetual servitude. This feels like Christian love, right? So, when we are thinking about land acknowledgments, one of the things we need to think about is how land has changed hands. And first we think on the large scale, and then we'll think on the small scale. Large scale, this map comes to us from a website called native-land.ca. This is a tremendously powerful resource for any land in the United States or Canada. This group has mapped every piece of land that was ceded by a native nation to the government, and they have a link to the treaty. So we're not talking about whether the treaty was just. That's a whole other conversation, and those are ugly. But a cession, C-E-S-S-I-O-N, a cession is the forced ceding of land. The land that we are on was ceded through Cession 174. That's that darker colored area. Most of Madison is covered by that. There's another one like on the very, very far west side, but most of Madison is covered by Cession 174. You can see how big that area was. A bunch of Ho-Chunk signed on a treaty with the US government, first in 1822, then in 1837, then in 1846. And progressively gave up more rights to this land. More points about the loss of this land. Large scale, you've heard of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, allows land on the US frontier to be freed up for development, like say, homesteading, railroads, all sorts of great uses. It passes from Indian ownership, which is not how Native folks would understand it, right, into government hands. The Dawes Act, homesteading, and settler purchase of property. So instead of land being held collectively by a people, land is held individually owned. Icky. But on this website, you can search for any land, any language, any treaty engaged in any piece of land, any property in a particular area. This is what it looks like when you click through and you can read the language of Cession 174. And on your very own computer screen, you can enlarge it so it's actually readable. Little excerpt. 1832, Rock Island, Illinois. The Winnebago Nation hereby cedes to the U.S. all lands to which said nation have title or claim lying to the south and east of the Wisconsin River and the Fox River of Green Bay, bounded as follows. In consideration of the above cession, the U.S. agreed to grant to the Winnebago Nation to be held as other Indian lands are held that part of the tract of county on the west side of the Mississippi River known as the neutral ground. West side of the Mississippi, wait a minute. They have no connection to the land on the west side of the Mississippi, known as the neutral ground, embraced within the following limits, beginning on the blah, 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 blah. 20 miles above the mouth of the Mississippi River, 20 miles above the mouth of the upper Iowa River, where the line of the lands purchased of the Sioux Indians, as described in the third article of the Treaty of July 15th, 1830. Wait a minute, where did the Sioux go? So we've got these serial removals, right? We're going to bump somebody, we're going to bump somebody else, we're going to bump somebody else, and we just keep pushing west. By Treaty of November 1, 1837, the Winnebagos ceded their right to a portion of this tract, excepting for hunting purposes. By Treaty of October 13, 1846, the Winnebago made an absolute cession of the entire tract. Winnebago is what others called them. They call themselves the Ho-Chunk. Questions right here? Okay. Onward. That's large scale. How land changed hands. If you know anybody with a property deed going back to around 1830, congratulations. That's literally when it changed hands. And you've got a trail that shows you that entire time period. However, if you're not someone who has that far back of a history, you want to look at small scale how land has changed hands. And that's when you make friends with the county register of deeds. And you can look at the settler history of the land you're on, how it's changed hands, who's been displaced, what resources were used to acquire it, what resources were used to develop it, what kind of labor was used to develop it. Depends how deeply people are prepared to dig into this. But there are always questions of justice about the labor and the resources used in acquisition of land as well. So this is setting us up for the actual question of what's needed in a land acknowledgement done better. This is what you're actually here for. Here we come. So if you've taken a nap, wake up. This comes to me from my friend, Mr. Bill Quackenbush, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Ho-Chunk Nation. A definitive land acknowledgement statement only needs 3 things. 1, what has occurred? 2, to whom? And 3, a positive commitment to rectify the transgression. Most land acknowledgement statements leave out number 3. We're very good at saying, this is the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Okay. From time immemorial. Great. And Bill also says it doesn't have to be wildly long. Best land acknowledgement statements are done in 100 to 125 words, so you actually use them. If you write it and you say it once and you never use it again because it's so long, then what's the point, right? It's like the best strategic plans that you make and you put on a shelf. Don't do that. If you ever catch yourself saying, we did a land acknowledgement, think twice. We need to be doing land acknowledgements. We wrote a land acknowledgement, we're working with it. We're thinking about revising it because we've learned more and we want to do more. In a land acknowledgement, specificity matters. So this isn't just a generic, there are problems between Native Americans and settler colonizers in the US, and we intend to do something about it. But these are the people who are impacted here. We're going to use the right names. We're not going to call the Ho-Chunk the Winnebago. If you're going to talk about the land and the water, try and think about them as who and not what, right? And talk about your particular role and response. What are we going to do? So again, not just a generic, we commit to working towards a more just relationship. That's great. And any of you who have worked on relationship repair know that amends require a concrete commitment. What am I going to do? What are we going to do? Other than say, I'm sorry. So thinking about what role that your community or your tradition played might give you some clues about where you want to go. What was your family part of? What was the Presbyterian Church part of? What were the settlers in this area of Wisconsin part of? What makes sense to name? Ultimately, the question is, what hard thing will we do that's directly connected to the brokenness that will help the repair? That's the key question of number 3. And you should probably spend the most time on that.
That seems like the hardest thing to even get your arms around.
I have some examples.
Right.
Because what I find as I go around and teach these workshops is that people say, oh, sure, I can do research, right? I can do research. That's really concrete. And I can find out who has been here, who is here, and, I can reach out and try and make connections. But what in the world do we do about it? And, how do we overcome the whatabouts? This happened so long ago, and what can we do now? And how can we possibly make up for the magnitude of what has happened in the past? You can't atone for the magnitude of what has happened in the past, but you can take appropriate steps based on who you are today that at least relate to the role of ancestors and where you are in the world today.
Kerri, can I ask a question?
Yes.
When you have emphasized hard thing,
Yep.
hard thing. And to my thinking, hard thing means you're giving something up, right?
Yes.
Is there some other aspect of hard things that are difficult for us to do that you would encourage us to think about when we're thinking of that?
What hard thing will we do? Enjoy choir. I'm going to show a graphic in a couple of slides that I think might help with that. But thinking of some kind of surrender, giving up something that is valuable to you, your time, your attention, your connections. For some, it's their wealth. What things are significant to you that you can share, give up, give into relationship as a signifier of value and intent. Does that make sense? So some of the examples I have, these are concrete examples from folks that I've been in conversation with. The Presbytery of Milwaukee wrote their land acknowledgement and felt especially convicted about the role of Presbyterians in boarding schools. They researched all of the Presbyterian-related boarding schools and named them in their land acknowledgement. And then in their step 3, they said they are especially going to support language and culture reclamation projects because the boarding schools stripped away language and culture. So, one-to-one connection. Use of distasteful and harmful names. You've heard the whole high school mascot debate, college mascot debate, etc. There are churches that are named after geological features that use terms that are hateful, harmful to Native Americans, that have taken up the question, can we rename ourselves? And this isn't just a pro forma thing, because it's like you're going down the road and you see an ethnic slur on a billboard and you go, I hate that. right? It's not just, oh, sure, it's a name. It is really important because you don't have to see that every day, and it's taking this concern seriously. And they're doing it in consultation with Native peoples. My denomination, the United Church of Christ, has a church camp on Green Lake that we've had for over 60 years now. And historically, it was named Pilgrim Center. We passed a resolution against the doctrine of discovery. And one of our members from the Ho-Chunk Church said, okay, now what are you going to do about the name of the camp? Okay, in relationship with the directly impacted people, we said, heard. And we met with them and with constituents over a period of 2 years. And the camp is now called Dechola Center, after the Ho-Chunk name for the lake. But we didn't just slap a name on it. We did the work in consultation with the people. If we're living and worshiping and teaching on ceded land, we can look at things like rent payments, shared stewardship, and land back. I know a church out in Cottage Grove that has land that they can trace back to the farmers who got it in 1830 from the US government. And they're talking to the Ho-Chunk about what the land was used for before it passed into US government hands and how they can steward it in partnership, right? They have a huge tract of land they got from the farm family. How can we do this together? How can we create sacred space here that's not just for the church, it's for the wider community? Any of you know St. Dunstan's Episcopal Church here on the west side of town? St. Dunstan's did their work on a land acknowledgement. They put into their budget every year a voluntary land tax. Their land is commercially valuable, and every year they are giving money to the Wisconsin Intertribal Repatriation Committee, which educates folks and repatriates the remains of ancestors and brings home cultural objects. Ways that you can take the fact that you are living on ceded land and connect it with what you're doing now, starting in sustainable ways and growing over time. And then if you've been living as if Native people are past tense, understand that 40% of people in America believe that there are no living Native Americans. If you are living as if Native people are past tense, do teaching and relationship building and make it impossible for people in your circles to believe that. This is, Doug, this is the diagram that I was talking about. This comes from a group called Sacred Reckonings out of Minneapolis, out of the Twin Cities. And they remind us that restorative practice leads to more restorative practice. If you get involved in truth telling, that affects you spiritually. It leads you deeper into spiritual practice, leads you into relationship, leads you into political solidarity, leads you into wealth return, and on and on and on. It's what's sometimes called a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious cycle. One taps you into the other, into the other. There is no bad place to enter this circle. You go round and round and round. They all inform one another. Would have brought it with me, but it's a 253-page PDF that they have. But I highly commend their work. It's amazing, and it's done in solidarity with people of color, including Native folks. sacredreckonings.com. The council has ways for you to tap into all of these types of restorative practice. And this is part of why I'm going around preaching these sermons and doing these workshops, to invite people to pick a starting point and dive in. Some actions being taken by Wisconsin churches. Churches are researching the history of the land they're on. They're attending events held by Wisconsin Indigenous peoples. They're building relationships. They're supporting language projects. I talked about the annual land tax. They're seeking guidance on land use. They're promoting continuing and community education events. They're renaming themselves. They're financially supporting specific Native congregations in Wisconsin. You know how financial stewardship and the annual stewardship campaign is a thing, even for a vital church like Covenant, right? Now imagine that you are a Native congregation and you're in a community that has systematically been stripped of financial resources, and you're trying to sustain a full-time pastorate. There are churches that are financially supporting specific Native congregations in Wisconsin. The council's compiling a list. If you wanted to make a gift to support Native congregations, we could do that, and we can make that feasible for you to make that connection. I mentioned Brothertown Indian Nation and their efforts for the restoration of their federal recognition. That would be an act of political allyship on that diagram we just looked at. The Wisconsin Council of Churches has a community investment program, and we invest in community development financial institutions. You did not come here for an investment seminar, so I'm going to give you like the nutshell. We pool money invested by member churches and presbyteries and conferences and individuals who are members of them. We pool that money, invest it in these community development financial institutions like Forward Community Investments and folks like that. And they loan it out to entrepreneurs and small businesses in underbanked communities. There are 4 Native community development financial institutions like that in Wisconsin, and we have committed to investing in all of them. So a way that people can invest their wealth and commit their wealth to this kind of reparative action is putting their funds into that investment, micro investing, right? These are just some actions being taken by Wisconsin churches. I had a church that heard this last year and decided to invest $72,000. Come on. Doesn't have to be that much. The minimum investment, I think, is $3,000. So, you put this all together. Here's what I'm saying. Do your homework. It's okay if it takes a while. This tendency to rush is whiteness talking. White folks are really good at saying, we have a deadline, we want to get it done. It's okay to sit with things and take the time and learn and be in relationship. Relationship time matters in this project. Workshop pieces with your community and your partners. Expect to make mistakes. Check to make sure your references are present tense. Check yourself. Are you uncomfortable? If you're not uncomfortable, why? This is supposed to be hard work. I have been a parish pastor. I know we want church to be comfortable. And I know we want church to be safe. But this is justice work. And this is a place where we have to push ourselves past church nice to do the hard work, to make ourselves uncomfortable. If we're in relationship with Native folks, take their recommendations seriously. If they say, I'm so glad you wanted to do X, but we really need you to do Y, do Y. Make changes if we need to. Educate the community, find ways to use the statements regularly, make them living documents. Be willing to go back to the beginning, right? It's not past tense. It's not, hey, this is done. It's, we started. Great. And we're starting again. Progress over perfection. Always progress over perfection. I promised I'd put my email up. It's on there. I'm sorry. It's a little bit on the edge. So it's execdir@wichurches.org. And we still have time for questions. So talk to me. What do you want to know? What do you wonder about? And I will do my best to repeat questions so the whole room and YouTube can hear. Doug.
Kerri, you did mention at the beginning that some of us are coming here for different reasons, and one of them that I mentioned to you is I co-chair my law firm's DEI committee. We've been talking about land acknowledgments, and we don't really know where to start. This is a great place to start, and I'd love to be able to bring somebody in to talk about it into my business. Probably would prefer to bring in someone who speaks on behalf of the Ho-Chunk Nation. Is the name that you put up at the beginning, is that a good person to contact? Or do you have a recommendation of a person to contact?
The Tribal Historic Preservation Offices are great places to start if you're looking to do secular work on land acknowledgments. They have multiple staff members, not a lot, but what I would say is plan on compensating them if you bring them in. My best learning comes from them. And one of the reasons that I advocate churches that are looking at wealth surrender give to this intertribal fund like St. Dunstan's did is because they do a lot of work educating predominantly white communities. So if we're saying, please help us do better, then let's not take resources out of the community by saying educate us. Let's resource them to help us. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you.
The other thing I would say is that mantra, don't rush, relationship time, not clock time, always applies when you are working with Native people. We need to understand that they have lots of priorities, they are underfunded, and they are not at our beck and call, right? We're operating in a business mindset. They're operating in their own cultural mindset. Yes?
You mentioned the three things that you were talking about. The one, language and culture education.
Yep.
Where does that fit into what potentially churches could do? I understand the money and I understand the name change, but the language and culture education, where does that, I didn't hear you mention a to-do on that.
So the various of the tribal nations in Wisconsin have educational programs where they teach language and culture. So, for example, the Oneida Nation has a school where children can learn the Great Thanksgiving, which is a big part of Oneida culture, every day. And so like they walk in and they're like surrounded. It's infused into the day. So as opposed to being indoctrinated into Western education, and, you know, kind of our factory model of education, right? They're imbued with the cultural mindset as well as learning the academics, right? The Menominee have online lessons for adults and children to learn language together. So once a week, it's literally language learning, and once a week, it's just online conversation. And so you practice what you've learned. And so putting on these programs comes with a cost. And so to be able to say to the nations, I understand this is a program you have, can we please help support that? Another situation that happens, and this may be of interest to the law firm, I was talking in my sermon about the importance of defending the land rights and the water rights of the nations. Sometimes the deepest need of a nation is to send their young adults to college and law school, to defend land and water rights, to defend child welfare. The Indian Child Welfare Act is the principal area of law practice for the tribal chair and tribal vice chair of Brothertown Nation. This is the only area they practice in to try and keep Native children with their families. So, you know, the importance of, if you want to make a financial commitment and you believe that scholarships are important, or you believe land rights are important, can we talk to you about making a financial gift that would help in this area? Native Nation I am in relationship with, how would this sit with you? And again, always to say, no, actually, we would rather have you make a gift to Z instead of X. Okay. Miranda Hassett, the rector at St. Dunstan's, first came to the Ho-Chunk Nation and said, we'd like to make a gift to the Ho-Chunk Nation. And the Ho-Chunk Nation folks said, actually, that's not how we work. We would rather establish a fund under the intertribal office so it benefits everybody. Heard, I will follow what your instruction is. Always in relationship. Doesn't mean we can't come forward with our first idea or our second, but always in relationship. One of the things I do on a quarterly basis is sit with the Intertribal Repatriation Committee. And it's made up of representatives from all of the tribal nations, from these tribal historic preservation offices, and from the Department of Transportation, and from the museums, and from the State Historical Society. And if you followed the story of the canoe found at the bottom of the lake, that was first discussed there with the state archaeologist. And how do we bring this up in a way that is culturally sensitive? How do we preserve it in a way that's culturally sensitive? Are you okay with this being preserved because we have to infuse it with chemicals in order to preserve it? Are you good with this? Says the State Archaeology Office. And so watching this careful negotiation, listening to the negotiation between the Milwaukee Public Museum and the people, as they say, we have human remains, we have ancestors. We don't have places for them all, and we have an obligation to repatriate them. And hearing a Ho-Chunk elder say, we have 200 people we need to bring home who need to be home in Mother Earth, and listening deeply to that. This has been part of my call over the past year, and bearing witness on behalf of the churches so I can bring stories to you and help you understand that this is ongoing work between us. This is an ongoing commitment we need to make to each other. There are so many stories of bad behavior by churches, by businesses, by individuals, and we could spend all day talking about those, but there are also so many hopeful stories, like the ones I told you about churches making decisions, about the tribal historic folks working on ethnobotany projects for seed protection and preserving species. And I have another sermon I preach on this that talks about the things we can learn from folks who have survived apocalypses, right? The world is always ending. It's always ending. And what can we learn from the folks who have survived so many endings? We need to know how to be resilient. Unfortunately, we've been part of them having to learn resilience. So, again, I love being able to have these conversations with church folks, and I'm so grateful for your attention. So. Sorry, dancing.
Thank you, Kerri. And if anyone didn't go to the first service, there's another opportunity at the second service following this. So I encourage you to listen. It was beautiful. Thank you.
And if I could just make one quick announcement, we still have plenty of goodies and coffee. Right through these two doors behind you. There are also some to-go containers because we have leftovers also from Megan's installation yesterday.
Oh my goodness.
So please,
All the so much food.
one more sweep through and see if there's something you might like.
And just while we're doing announcements, we also are looking for a few more volunteers to write a devotional for Exodus. So there is a clipboard that Nancy's got, and
I'm going around.
going around. Okay, fantastic. So if anyone is feeling like they really would like to do that, we would be very appreciative. I think there's only like six slots left out of 40 chapters, so we're getting there.
Melissa, remind me, are those due tomorrow?
I think they're due on Wednesday. That's a good thing to know.
Sorry to rain a little bit on the parade, but there's no one to reality.
Yeah, thank you.